Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to be back together. So we are going to be talking. This is very exciting, by the way. For those of you who aren't here, right across from me is an actual real-life Josiah, and we are going to be talking about King Josiah today. So if you see real-life Josiah looking up a lot, you know why that's happening. We're talking about someone who is really, or at least his reign, his administration, is one of the most eventful administrations, one of the most eventful moments in Jewish history, and we almost never talk about him. Does anyone here have like strong feelings or associations around King Josiah? Anyone have memories from Hebrew school as a kid or something of Josiah? I wouldn't think so, but he's not someone we usually talk about. Okay, so let's back up. Let's tell our story just to reorient ourselves because we sort of went out of order last week with the Hanukkah story. So as a reminder, what we're doing is we're talking about who were the first people who thought of themselves as us, and what was the story that they told themselves about who they are, where they came from, and how they're supposed to live in this world. And then we're tracing that question, or those sets of questions, through Jewish history as we go. This makes sense, yeah? We've been over this a few times now, I think. So we've looked at the very first people to think of themselves as Jews. We looked at 1250 BCE or so, the emergence of something like Jewish identity, even though they wouldn't have used that word, in the north of Israel, in the areas that we would now call the West Bank. And the folks there had stories that looked like proto-Exodus stories of having come from the southern kingdom, the southern empire, right, the Egyptian empire, through a slave rebellion and settled in that region. Meanwhile, at the same time, also 1250-ish BCE, we find in the south of Israel a very different culture, a very different society, nomadic society, a shepherding society, and their stories were the stories of Abraham, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, so on and so forth. These were different bodies of story. These were different bodies of mythology. And so we looked at the way that as both of these states became vassal states of the Assyrian Empire, the great northern empire, we looked at ways that particularly after then the north stopped paying its taxes to the Assyrian state, there was a slow exodus, there was a slow wave, and sometimes faster than others, of refugees in the 700s, in the 8th century BCE. We've talked about it as being 750, but again, that's not an exact year. That's just a sort of plus minus 20 years kind of range. We've talked about the ways that this drove northern refugees with their stories into Jerusalem, in particular, but into the south. We looked at the ways that in the year 1000, sorry, we skipped a step backing up a little bit, 1000 BCE, when this southern king came to power over all the southern tribes and then conquered and occupied the north. We looked at how unpopular that occupation was. This is, of course, the occupation of King David of the north. But then, just a few hundred years later, when the Assyrians come and destroy the north, all of a sudden it's not the story of David being the occupying evil king. All of a sudden it's a claiming of David by the southerners, right? Or by the northerners, excuse me. Remember, our southern cousins, how we're all a part of the same family anyways. And we've used this as an example of the story of us, the way that Judaism has operated, the Jewish story has operated throughout history, in that we are not about history, we are about memory. We're about the way that we tell stories to bring meaning to our moments today. Backing away for a second, I actually think this is one of the hardest struggles I am having at this moment in a post-October 7th world as a synagogue rabbi. To me, I'm not nearly struggling as much, and some rabbis are, with the tension about what do you say, what do you not say, how are you going to make this congregant mad or that congregant mad. Or to me, it's much more about the fact that actually I think what we need more of when it comes to Israel and Palestine is history, meaning seeing the real there, is treating these as real places with real people and real politics, and a lot less mythology, a lot less storytelling about ourselves into it. And yet this is in such contrast with why people come to synagogues. Right, I keep feeling this after I'm done talking about Israel, and I just feel like I have spent an hour or 2 hours being a downer to people and popping all the bubbles of mythology that they have, and how contrary that is to why people come to synagogue. Which, whatever their individual theologies, I think we come because we're looking for meaning and hope and inspiration, and so there's a real tension there. And back to the story of us, of course, what we're trying to do here is to hold up the history of our mythology, with the point of better understanding mythology, but also better understanding ourselves in this moment as myth makers and myth tellers, which is to say that we are just as authentic of tellers of the Jewish story as anyone who has lived at any point in Jewish history. We all do this, and we always have done this, in the same way that those northern Israelites fleeing south in 750 BCE from the Assyrian invasion retold the David story as a way of welcoming themselves, or trying to get the southerners to welcome them into that kingdom. Did that make sense? Did I close that circle there? Okay, great. So what we're going to be dealing with today is what comes afterwards. Because if you'll remember that the northerners, the reason they get in trouble, the reason that the northern tribes are wiped out, the reason that the 10 lost tribes are lost, is because they stopped paying their taxes to the Assyrians. However, this movement of northerners into the south, this happens at a moment right when the northerners believe that the Assyrian Empire is crumbling and they don't have to keep paying their taxes. And they were just like 50 or 70 years too early. So we're going to be looking at it. If that last session was all about what happens in the 8th century, the 700s, this week we're going to be looking at about 150 years later or so. We're going to be looking at the 620s BCE. Okay, so first let's position ourselves a little bit. If you are a Jew living in a Judean, if you are, right, again, Jew is not a religious frame, it's an ethnic frame, a national frame, a tribal frame during this time period, not a religious frame. But if you are a Jew living in 620 BCE, you're about as far away from the destruction of the North as we are today from the Civil War. So just as sort of a useful way of understanding where they were in history and in the way that this society has changed and the world has changed and who wasn't accepted and has been. We're talking about that level of distance. So in memory, certainly, would have been a part of the history or of the stories that almost everyone would have known, and long enough ago that it's being mythologized. Make sense? Okay, so all of these northerners have fled to the south. They have fled primarily to Jerusalem, where they have settled these refugees from the north. And they have been about as welcomed, as I mentioned before, as refugees, mass influxes of refugees are at all places and all times, which is to say not very welcomed at all pretty frequently. However, 150 or so years later, in many ways those divisions, while they still would exist, while there still would have been some sense of, oh, Bev, you're really, I know we live in Jerusalem together, but you're from a northern family and I'm not really sure I want you marrying my son. There's other reasons I don't think you should marry my son also, but that's, right, that certainly there would have been some of that, but we're talking enough time has gone by that for a lot of people they would have had actually ancestry that contained both sets of stories, both bodies of mythology, which is to say that for the vast number of people, particularly in Jerusalem by that point, particularly in the political elite, they would have had claim to the southern stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs and to the northern stories of the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, that is our set piece before we jump in. Any questions or thoughts or comments or... I'm looking up, when you see me looking this way, I'm looking at the Zoomers. Zoomers, nothing? Oh, I see chat. Let me look in the chat. Nope, that's older. Jim, thank you for the no joke link. Okay. So let's actually jump into some text here. We're going to go to Sepharia. Here we go. I think everyone should be able to see this now. There we go. Yep. Okay, and one of the easier references to remember, we are going to the book of Kings, 2 Kings, by the way. Anyone know why there's a first book of Kings and a second book of Kings? Because it was... The scrolls were too big. Larry's got it. It's a technical issue that they couldn't have a scroll that was that large. I went too far here, way too far. Where are we? There we are. Same with the minor prophets, by the way. What makes them minor is not their significance, but the length of their texts. And so the 12 minor prophets would have been in one document, was the idea, that you could hold them in a scroll, as opposed to Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, who are the major prophets, not major because they're more important, but major because the books are much, much longer. Okay, so we are going to, very memorable, 2 Kings 22. And here we go. Let's see. And just for ease of reading, we are going to switch to that layout. And hoping I'm pressing this button right. Yes, good. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and read. Is there someone... Please, just loudly so the microphone picks you up.
Okay. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem.
Okay, pause. First of all, remember we're talking about the 620s, 622 or something BCE. What do we immediately know about Josiah's reign from just this first line? What do we know about when Josiah came to power?
He was young.
He was young, and what does that mean?
Someone else had the reins.
Someone else had the reins. So this is a moment all of a sudden where the historical powers aren't present. And I think that's what enables part of the revolution of Josiah's moment. The Assyrian kingdom had collapsed, so there's not this overlord of empire in quite the same way, though that's coming again very soon from the Babylonians, but we're in this sort of golden moment. And we've got an incredibly young king, which means the advisors, the scribes, the priests, his mom, these sorts of folks are going to be a power source within Israel. So we both have a more powerful Jewish state because of independence from the empire, and we've got a different kind of power structure happening there. He reigns for 31 years, which is a pretty long time for someone to be king, though I guess maybe it didn't feel that way if he's dying when he is 39 years old. But okay, let's keep going.
His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adai,
Yep.
and of Bazkat.
Okay, so we're getting location, we're getting great.
Want me to keep going?
Please, good.
Okay.
Yep.
He did what was pleasing to God, and he followed all the ways of his forefather David. He did not deviate to the right or to the left.
Okay, let's pause for a moment and talk a little bit about these books. So we know almost certainly that the books of Deuteronomy, the books of Joshua, Samuel, Kings, maybe Ruth, but certainly those ones I just named, were written in close to the version that we have them today by the court of King Josiah. The other thing to say is that this was a real golden age for the kingdom, right? All of a sudden there's no empire to control them. And so like every golden age, they are invested in telling and preserving their own sacred histories and their own sacred stories. And remember that if you're not making copies of texts during this time period, they are literally crumbling away into nothing. These texts would not have been understood as scripture, as divine revelation, word for word, as contemporary religious folks would understand them. These were their sacred histories. But it means that as they were making copies, of course there are notes, there are additions, there are changes that are going into these texts as a part of copying them and keeping them going. And that's not seen as something cynical. It's not seen as undermining scripture or something. It's just the process of what is happening. These people understood the world as operating through a number of key concepts, and we're going to see this again and again and again. The first is the centralization of the cult into Jerusalem. Sarah, I see your hand. We'll get you eventually. Is the centralization of the cult into Jerusalem, meaning the only place that you were allowed to offer sacrifices. I'm going to turn off this share for a minute. The only place you were allowed to offer sacrifices was at the temple. I need you to understand this through a Marxist lens and not through a religious lens. This was a power move. Think about the amount of legislative power, of executive power you have to have a law like that and then enforce it throughout the land. So this is a power move. And the other reason I think we need to use Marxist analysis here is you got to understand it through economics. Saying this is the only place you can offer sacrifices means you've got a huge influx of wealth and tourism and all of these pieces into the capital city of Jerusalem. All of which is to say, when we think about King David's Jerusalem, we instead need to remember that actually we should be thinking of King Josiah's Jerusalem, and that it's King Josiah's court that becomes invested in telling the stories of a heroic and messianic King David. Right? They are placing their own greatness into King David. Maybe think of it like JFK's tenure being Camelot. Think of it a little bit that way, if that makes sense. That's the first of these three things. Centralization of the cult, meaning Jerusalem only. And again, think of it through the economics and the power structures of what that means. Number two is mono-worship. Now, we've talked about this so far, that these people are not monotheists by any understanding of that phrase. They've got all sorts of different gods. There's a Mel Brooks joke that's slightly off color that I won't tell here, but right, they've got all of these different deities for everything. But what's happening is that King Josiah's court says you're only allowed to offer sacrifices to this one official state deity at this one official state deity's home in Jerusalem. Okay? Now, again, I want us to think in a Marxist frame here. Think about who that gives power to. It's giving power and wealth to the priests in Jerusalem. Who's it taking power from? The priests outside of Jerusalem. So who's going to be really happy about this? The priests in Jerusalem, who say, by the way, that their ancient ancestor is Aaron, as opposed to the priests outside of Jerusalem who are upset, who just come from the tribe of the Levites. So all of a sudden, if there is only one place that these Jerusalemite priests, or only one place that any priest, which is a job that you get by having your dad be the priest, if the only place that priests can do their work and earn a living and earn food is in Jerusalem, you can imagine that there's a huge influx of priests to Jerusalem. Kohanes, by the way. This is where we get the division between Kohanes and Levites, which is to say that Kohanes are our Jerusalemite priests who claim descent directly from Aaron, whereas the Levites become the second-class priests from outside Jerusalem, who are just a part of the tribe in general. Okay, I think we've mentioned this before, but Aaron is a unquestionable good guy in the Torah, except for one chapter. What's the story where Aaron's the bad guy? It's the golden calf. So, again, applying the same sort of economics first read here, we can really understand the golden calf story as a trashing of the Jerusalemite Aaron claimed descended priests of Jerusalem by the non-Jerusalemite priests who have nowhere else that they can work now. The politics of the golden calf story that we would never see, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did that make sense, what I just said? Okay. The third piece I want us to keep in mind when we are talking about the Deuteronomists or the King Josiah court or whatever words you want to place around this. Again, first was worship, mono worship, only worshiping this one deity. The second was, I'm doing these reverse, sorry. The second was centralization of the cult, only offering sacrifices in Jerusalem. The third is a worldview that sees reward and punishment for the observance and the non-observance of the commandments being just how the world works. Now, this is not direct individual karma. It is generally understood as collective punishment for individual sin. So you eat that bacon cheeseburger on Passover, and that's why we didn't get enough rain during the growing season this year. That's the sort of frame here. I want to suggest that the people who present the text this way, and we see this, by the way, the only places we see this are in these Deuteronomical texts, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel. I skipped Judges before, apologies. That's where we see this, but we see all three of them. We see all three of these things, but particularly this view that we are rewarded or punished for the observance or the non-observance of the commandments. I really don't think it's cynical. It's how they understood their world, as much as we understand that if I drop this cup, it's going to fall because of gravity. This is also, I want to suggest, before we dismiss this as an absurd theology, and it is absurd and damaging and problematic in some real ways, I also want to suggest there's something very human about seeing this world, the world this way. First of all, this is behind the ultra-Orthodox explanation for why the Holocaust happened in Germany. The answer was Reformed Jews weren't keeping the commandments. This is just one of many explanations, right? But I think this is also why so often, if God forbid you hear of someone who has lung cancer, what's the first question that we often have in our minds, or we often ask? Oh, I didn't know they smoked, right?
Yeah.
Which again, we know that there is a connection, obviously, between these things, but I also think that response within us is a part of wanting to see order and cause and effect and reward and punishment in the world, because we want that in a very human way. You look like you're going to say something, Nancy.
No, I was just agreeing.
So again, those are the three things we should be thinking about, and we're going to go back to the text here in a moment. But when we think of King Josiah and his court. Sarah, go ahead. No. The way that priests in the priestly operations worked and the way that it was a caste, it predates this. Got it. When is the Torah done? Is that your question here? The answers were not there yet. The Torah, I have great confidence that if we could take a time machine and go back in time to about 400 BCE, we'd find a Torah that looks almost identical to what we have today. But the Torah as we know it is still very much an evolving document at this point. And yeah, it's like there's no official version is what we mean when we call it an oral tradition. Not that there aren't multiple written versions. It exists out there as written text at times and as different written text at times, and more significantly exists out there is a story that people know, and not that this particular written text is the official version of it. That's coming a little later. So yeah, in some ways it is. Let's look at this. Let's keep going with the text. I think that's going to get us there. So let's go back to Sepharia here. There we go. Okay, so all of that, by the way, that tangent, which was not a tangent, but was a tangent, was about he did what was pleasing to God and followed in the ways of his forefather David. He did not deviate to the right or to the left. So what we've got here is, first of all, presenting David as the mythological perfect, or the great, or the exemplar. Mm-hmm. Exemplar is probably our word here. And we might not see it here, but if we back away in the book of Kings, almost every king that is listed, and most of them we only get like 2 sentences. You know, so-and-so was the king, and they ruled for 3 years. Okay. Now, if they only ruled for 3 years, and we understand that reward and punishment comes for the observance or the non-observance of the commandments, and that the biggest, most important commandment for these people was mono-worship, the only deity you're allowed to worship is this deity, then what do we automatically know about that king who only ruled for 3 years?
He doesn't adhere to that.
He wasn't a good king, and he followed after idolatry.
Right.
And meanwhile, if we have a king who rules like Josiah did for 31 years, what do we immediately know about that king? That he followed. Exactly. Not a monotheist. Very much not a monotheist. But didn't worship idols, right? And so we know that right here in the code language for someone was a good king and did well was they followed in the ways of their forefather David. Again, you can see the emergence of what becomes the messianic tradition from this. Okay, let's keep going. Bev.
Okay, in the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent the scribe Shaphan, son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, to the house of God, saying...
Okay, so let's note that he has sent someone whose job it is to write and copy documents to the house of God, meaning to the temple.
Yeah.
Let's remember that the temple is going to be the main check on the power of the king. Okay? And so that's going to be the political tension. And remember that Josiah has just gone and ruled that this is the only place you can offer sacrifices, which is going to be popular. And all of a sudden there's these... it's going to mean you're going to need a bigger temple, right? The building's probably not going to work anymore. But it also means there's all of these other priests flooding in, and the Jerusalem priests aren't going to be so happy about that. So there's some real political tensions at play here with Josiah, who now is in the 18th year, so he's all of 26.
Okay, keep going.
Please.
Go to the high priest to Kilia, and let him weigh the silver that has been deposited in the house of God, which the guards of the threshold have collected from the people. And let it be delivered to overseers of the work who are in charge at house of God, that they...
Top.
In turn.
Oh, we're way up there. Okay. That they in turn pay out to the workers that are in the house of God for the repair of the house.
Keep going through the next 2 verses.
Okay, to the carpenters, the laborers, and the masons, and for the purchase of wood and quarried stones for repairing the house. However, no check is to be kept on them for the silver that is delivered to them, for they deal honestly.
Okay, let's pause for a moment, because there have been a number of studies that have looked at what are the factors involved in theft and embezzlement. Is it religiosity, right? If you're more religious or less religious. Is it your politics? Is it, people have tried to make this obviously about race in some very awful, problematic studies. People have made it about almost anything you can imagine. Gender, and you know what the most important factor is? How likely you think you are to get caught. Which I want to suggest is just inherently true, right? Think about the ways that you all steal, because we all do. Okay, I'll take home some cups from CRC today
Right.
because we're having people over, right? Or whatever it
Right.
that's theft. We just have judged that we're not going to get in trouble for it. And that's really what it is. So I want to suggest that when humans have never been different from how they are, and so when they say, you know what, here's my credit card, go to the store, here's some, don't worry, I don't need the receipts, you get yourself something nice, right? This is a bribe to the priests. That plain and simple, that is what we are seeing here, is a bribe to the people who control the temple.
Because they're so honest.
Because they're so honest, exactly. Okay, I had seen a hand a moment ago that was popped up. I don't see it up anymore. Put that hand back up if you still have your question. But okay, so we've got King Josiah, who's come of age, who's dealing with the politics of his reign and of this power that no other king has had really before him. And he is invested in buying off the priests. And immediately after he buys off the priests, there's no separation here, right? Don't worry about the receipts. Immediately we get this verse.
Then the high priest Achiliah said to the scribe Shaphan, I have found a scroll of the teaching of the house of God. And Achiliah gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it.
Okay, so it's really a remarkable thing that immediately after King Josiah says, I don't need any receipts, they find something that he's been looking for, which is to say they find a lost scroll of, how do they describe it here? I found a scroll of the teaching in the house of God. But I actually want to read the Hebrew here for you, because what they have found is, in fact, a Sefer Torah. The word is Torah. Almost certainly what we're dealing with here is the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, when you look at it, right, just look at it on its face for a moment. And Paul, I see your hand. I'll get to you in just a second. If you look at Deuteronomy on its face, it is a retelling of the stories of Moses that came before it. In fact, the rabbis name it Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah. That's the code for it in the Talmud. And in fact, the English Deuteronomy is, again, I guess it's not the English, but the word we use in English, right, is the retelling of the story of the law. So there's always been this awareness that Deuteronomy feels like a duplication. And we've got it right here in the text, which is to say that we should understand Deuteronomy as being the Jerusalem-centered retelling of the northern stories of the Exodus. I'm going to say that again. Deuteronomy is the Jerusalem-centered Jerusalem-centered retelling of the northern stories of the Exodus from Egypt. This is 150 years or so after those northern refugees have fled south, bringing their stories of the Exodus, and now we are getting an official Jerusalem version of it. Now we get so used, and I've mentioned a version of this before in our class, but we get so used to reading the Torah as one document that we sometimes miss that the covenant that exists between God and the people is 3 different covenants in the Torah itself. Not even talking about the Davidic covenant, which is separate also, but within the Torah itself. We get the covenant with Abraham, in which Abraham doesn't have to do anything, and God has to do everything, right? Abraham just has to go, and then God will make him as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand in the beach and land flowing with milk and honey and riches and right, land progeny and wealth. Then we get the Exodus covenant. Think about the version of the covenant in the book of Exodus, the book of Numbers, the book of Leviticus to some extent. And here it's in many ways the opposite, actually. All of these commandments, almost all of them, are framed in, you shall do this because I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, right? We can, I heard mumbling of people repeating that phrase because it is so often used. which is to say that the Exodus covenant is actually, God's already done God's part of the deal. Covenant's just a fancy word for contract. And now we have to uphold our side. Right? Why do you have to keep the commandments? Because God liberated us. Deuteronomy is different. In Deuteronomy, if you keep the commandments, then good things will happen to you. If you don't keep the commandments, then bad things will happen to you. Famously, there's a middle paragraph of the Shema that comes from the book of Deuteronomy. It's one of the first things the Reform movement got rid of. That, again, just straight out of Deuteronomy, that talks all about how if you keep the commandments, the rain will come in its season, and your crops will flourish, and your children will have enough to eat. And if you do not keep the commandments, drought will come, your children will wither on the vine and die. And, I mean, it's really kind of frank and disturbing, and you can see why the Reform movement got rid of it, the early Reform movement, because they looked at it and they said, we're not going to say it if we don't think it's true, and we don't think it's true. I want to suggest that maybe the contemporary Reform movement has other values other than absolute truth in quite the same way. Even maybe rejects the notion of having absolute truth, but in fact, there have been some really nice reclaimings of this through environmental lenses. If we treat the earth in one way, then it right. But that's a separate issue. Okay, Paul. Yeah, exactly. David for King Josiah and his court. David, by the time you get into the 620s BCE, David is the mythological, idealized ancestor of Jerusalem. He's the founder of Jerusalem in some way. I mean, not exactly, but as far as Jewish Jerusalem is concerned, he moves the capital there. And so David is looked on as being the golden age, even though Josiah is the actual golden age. And the stories we have of the Davidic golden age are being edited, preserved, redacted by Josiah's court, and so are being seen through these lenses. Yeah, great question. The other way of saying it, and we're going to deal more with this as we go in coming weeks, is that actually the Hebrew Bible, writ large, is filled with 3 bodies of mythology. Right? We've compared this to Star Trek and Star Wars, but now it's like Star Trek, Star Wars, and Battlestar Galactica or something, where you've got the Exodus stories, you've got the matriarch-patriarch stories, and you've got the Davidic stories. That these are actually 3 separate bodies of mythology that are sort of mashed together in the Hebrew Bible and come from 3 distinct geographies, with the northern stories being the Exodus stories, the southern stories being the matriarch-patriarch stories, and Jerusalem being the centering of the Davidic stories. Right? They tell the stories of a perfect and golden age David as a way of raising themselves up and telling their own story. You can tell what documents are edited or redacted by these people because you look for that reward and punishment. You look for that, if there's only one place you can offer sacrifices, you look for the notions against idolatry. That you can see the texts that were redacted and written by these people. Okay, does that make sense? So we see this throughout these books. These are the people who go and they collect these books and introduce each of these sections, reward and punishment. So let's just jump into Deuteronomy here for a second so we can see what this looks like in reality. You can keep going in this story, by the way. It keeps going on and on. It's pretty interesting. And it's kind of wild to have this within the Hebrew Bible itself. But let's just go to Deuteronomy. We'll go to the Shema, Deuteronomy 6. Okay. This is the instruction, the laws, and the rules that your God has commanded me to impart to you to observe the land that you're about to cross into, so that you, your children, and your children's children may revere Adonai and follow as long as you live all the divine laws I enjoin upon you. Obey Israel faithfully, that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as Adonai, the God of your ancestors, spoke to you. right? Do you see the conditionality of that? That's what we're looking for. When I taught Hebrew Bible at Bradley to undergrads on the midterm, I would always make them be able to identify Deuteronomic texts, because you should be able to tell that even if you've got two Moses stories next to each other, Exodus and Deuteronomy, you should always be able to tell what the Deuteronomy is based on these three things. If it cares about those, then it's Deuteronomy, right? In fact, I'm just going to sort of randomly skip ahead here. Those were the verses right before the Shema. Here's the second telling of the Ten Commandments. We've got the history here. And now, O Israel, what does your God demand of you? Only this, to revere God, to walk in the divine paths, to serve your God in all your heart, keeping the commandments and laws which I enjoin you this day. Mark the heavens to the utmost reaches of your God, and earth that is on it. Yet it was your ancestors that were drawn for love, so on and so forth. Cut away, therefore, the thickening about your hearts, and stiffen your necks no more, for God is supreme, so on and so forth. But upholds the fatherless, the widow, befriends the stranger. You too must do these things. You must revere Adonai. Okay, we are not told really to revere Adonai in the other places in quite the same way, because it's not, in fact, the next line is the key. Only your God shall you worship. Notice this is not monotheism. It's not saying there is only this God. It's saying you're only allowed to worship this God. You're only allowed to, worship is such a terrible word here. You're only, the word is to serve, to labor for, ta'avod, right? Only your God shall you serve. And it really doesn't matter. You can go almost anywhere in Deuteronomy. We're just skipping ahead again. You shall offer your burnt offerings, both the flesh and so on and so forth, on the altar of your God. Right, there's only one place that you can do it. Be careful to keep these commandments that I enjoin upon you. Thus it will go well with you and your descendants after you forever. If you want it to be good with you, keep the commandments. Okay, that was, again, just like a quick trot through Deuteronomy to give you a flavor of this. But we see this in all of these various books. We see it in these books that they wrote, in Deuteronomy, in Joshua, in Judges, in Samuel, in Kings. In all of these books, we see these three things repeated over and over again. We see the fingerprints of King Josiah and his reign. Okay. Thoughts on this, questions on this, before we sort of go a third of a step forward from here? Yeah, Paul. Yeah, so what we're getting here are the traditions of Moses as understood and written by the Jerusalem scribes of 600 BCE or so. And I think we also need to understand, I think it's how we take 2 Kings 22. Are people familiar with Josephus? Is this some of us are. Lisa, who's on here, a friend of hers, passed on an ancient copy of Josephus. 150 years old, ancient. Josephus is a historian who was a Jew who was involved in fighting the Romans, who's eventually captured or gives up. And he writes a court history of the Jews for the Roman emperor. Now, his history is incredibly valuable. It's one of the few histories we have from this time period about Jews. And it's really problematic because he's writing it for the Roman emperor. So all of the political considerations are involved of making sure that, first of all, he doesn't lose his head by writing this, but secondly, that he gets paid for writing this. I think the same is true then of something like Deuteronomy, right? The politics of this are going to be the same. And in fact, we get the money and the politics of it in that story in 2 Kings 22. So great question, Paul. Steve. Probably Josiah was a real person. Probably Josiah was a real kingship. Yeah. By the time we're getting into this time period, as a general rule, we can think of this as being based on historical figures. That's what I would say this is. That these are based on historical figures. We know that David was almost certainly a historical figure from some extra biblical accounts that we didn't used to have. I know we talked about that a month ago or so when we talked about David. But the further we get in history, the closer we get to people who just we have fair amounts of historical records about. I don't remember specifics about Josiah, but I would be incredibly surprised if we don't have significant extra biblical records of Josiah from trades and deals and foreign relations and pieces like this. So yeah, great question. We're almost certainly dealing with a real person here. Larry. What? And still, yeah, turns out politics is a rough business. Yeah, yeah, used to be even rougher. Yeah, good comment. Any other comments or questions about how far we've gone? Okay, so I think it's clear what can be abhorrent about a theology like this, right? The reward and punishment for the observance and the non-observance of the commandments. But I also want to hold out, and this is going to bring us to where we're going in future weeks, that this is also a theological revolution and a huge step closer to what we think of as being monotheism. Because if your God rewards you, well, let's back away for a moment. When two peoples would fight a battle in this ancient world, in this region, when Group A won, one of the things that we all knew for certain is that Group A's God is more powerful than Group B's God. Does that make sense? It's just sort of basic theology. In fact, I think I compared the theology of Micha Mocha, of the Song at the Sea, who is like you amongst the gods, Adonai, to playground theology. My God can beat up your God, right? But that's actually a core kind of idea here, and that's the way that God's operated, is that my God can beat up your God and will prove that by my people defeating your people, which means that if you lose, it means that it's your God that lost, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what's happening here, and it's not quite there with Josiah, but it'll be there by the time the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem just a few years after this, right? Josiah, we're talking about him being born maybe in the 620s, let's say. And the Babylonian destruction's 586. So it's not that far away that we're talking from Josiah's reign. By the time we get there, what it means is that you can understand a God who operates through history. It's just sort of taken for granted enough today that we don't miss how big of a revolution this is, right? A God that the reason, and this is what Jeremiah is going to do, and we'll look at Jeremiah after the Babylonian exile, right? That Jeremiah's explanation for who is at fault, who is to blame for the Babylonian exile? Does anyone know who Jeremiah blames? He blames us. Mm-hmm. In fact, he seems to blame almost everyone except for the Babylonians. And in fact, you'll find framings that suggest that the Babylonians are a tool of God. Mm-hmm. Because Josiah's theology enables a later theology that says that our God is punishing us with the Babylonian exile. This is, again, I think, victim blaming and pretty abhorrent in some core ways. But it also means when we are taken off into Babylonian enslavement, when we are taken off as refugees in Babylon, that we have a way of telling this story that is not about our God and our culture having lost. It's actually about our God punishing us with this foreign power. which is to say that it's a way of keeping our story alive once we are in Babylon. But that's for coming weeks. But just wanted to sort of take that next step, because I think it'll help us understand this journey. One other note here. So today, the fastest growing belief segment in the Jewish population is what? Does anyone know? It's atheism or agnosticism.
Oh, okay.
There's an old joke that says to be a Jew, you can believe in no more than one God. People have heard this joke before. But I actually think in an odd way we can trace a line from the polytheism of the earliest stories of the Torah through the monolatry, meaning my God is the biggest God, of later sources in the Torah, to the mono-worship, this is the only deity you're allowed to worship, that we get in Josiah and Deuteronomy and these texts, to some of the later prophets who almost are like actual real monotheists. You get some of this in some of the latest sources in the books of Isaiah, or the book of Isaiah, which is really a collection of lots of different pieces, to the rabbis who are monotheists, but monotheists in a sense that suggests that God walks and talks and is basically like a real big human being. You still get that with Rashi. By the time you get, to 1,000 years ago, Rashi still seems to believe that God walks and talks and has a body. And then you get Maimonides, who says, actually, no. God is the underlying truth of the universe that you can't ever say anything about. And how that is different than postmodern atheism, I'm not entirely sure. But you can see sort of a line going there, which is just wild to see. Not to suggest that this is inevitable or that it has to go in this direction or that history necessarily moves like this with theology, but it did move like this within our own story. Okay, I saw another hand on Zoom. Steve, did you have your hand up? Oh, Susan, please. Look, this is so now I'm changing a little bit from the sort of historical piece. But right, my read of Deuteronomy, the way that I internalize this and make sense of it and make meaning of it for me, my telling of the story of Deuteronomy, is very much the belief that when we put the best of ourselves into the world, that the world is a better place than when we put the worst of ourselves into the world. And that's, I think, an act of faith, because we don't know that that's true. Susan. So no, I don't think so. I actually think it's the earlier example, which is if you look at, for instance, the song at the sea, Micha Mocha. Micha Mocha comes from it. I'm forgetting what chapter this is. If someone looks it up and finds it, let us know. But if you look at the song of the sea, it really is a god who defeats Pharaoh's armies and Pharaoh's gods. That's what we see in the Song of the Sea. It is this sort of earlier model of we were victorious because our God is stronger than their God, as opposed to we are victorious because we followed the commandments, or we failed because we didn't follow the commandments. That's the difference there. Did that make sense? Other questions? Other thoughts? Nothing? That's it? Oh, yeah. No, please. Yeah, absolutely. it's also a mechanism for being self-critical that Deuteronomy unveils, right? If the bad things that happen to us are because of the things that we did wrong, it opens up a lens for what did we do wrong, and a conversation around what we did wrong. Now that can be very problematic too, right? There's also clear victim blaming here. The idea that if you read the Book of Lamentations, for instance, that a world destroyed by the Babylonians that has left infants being cooked, infants that have died being cooked because there's no food that is left, right? This world of destruction, saying that it's their own fault, is deeply problematic. By the way, I'm very cognizant of the ways that this sounds like how Gaza is being talked about and looks, and all of this, and the ways that self-blame can exist, right, is what's happening in Gaza because of Hamas and because of Palestinian support of Hamas, is what's happening on October 7th because of Israel's support of Hamas and the occupation, right? Like there's all these layers that can be both insightful and problematic and victim blaming and every piece of it, and that's what we're playing with here. And so it's too easy to dismiss these theologies of reward and punishment as simple minds of the past, because I think we all play these same mental games and have these mental theologies that have nothing to do with what we believe about God, but how we understand the universe and history and how it operates. Rudy. No, but you got to unmute yourself. We don't hear you, Rudy. You got to unmute yourself first. So we get interestingly, the Jewish idea, and it comes from the very center verse of the Torah, is you shall you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which I think is a version of the Golden Rule. But then Hillel famously sort of says I'm going to forget my logical words, but inverse of this, maybe that's the word. What is hateful to you, do not do unto others. This is how you should interpret the whole of the Torah. Now go and study. In that he's deriving from this notion that's the most commonly repeated commandment in the Torah, do not oppress, for you were oppressed. Great question. Larry, did I see you unmuted with a question? Yeah. So that's a great question. So broadly, well, first let me say a notion of Job. To start with, Job and Daniel are early mythological figures that seem to exist outside of necessarily a Jewish context, just a Levant context. Job, in particular, it's not even clear that he's a Jew. There's nothing in the story that makes it clear. And he exists in a place and a space out of time. It's not, within the story itself, we don't know exactly when this is happening. I mean, within its internal chronology. Probably, if my memory serves me right, this is a post-Persian document, at least in the version that we have it today. But again, is in some ways like a Camelot story for them, because it's dealing with an ancient mythological figure. Daniel also seems to have those sorts of precursors. But actually, the two books that I want us to think of as being in contrast to Deuteronomy are Job and Ecclesiastes.